Her clothes had been stolen. "Cowboy, help me!" The voice was thin, cracked, barely a whisper against the slow gurgle of the river. Colt Remington heard it just as the sun bled out across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. He was tired. Bone tired. The kind of tired that comes from wrestling with fence wire and stubborn cattle all day under a sun that gives no quarter. He was just about to turn his horse for the cabin for a plate of cold beans and a night of silence when that sound snagged his ear. He dismounted, letting the reins of his horse, Dusty, fall loose. His boots crunched on the dry, thirsty grass as he moved toward the cottonwoods lining the stream. At first, he thought it was an animal, maybe a doe caught in the brush. Then he saw her. She was standing knee-deep in the murky water, her back to him. Dark hair, wet and heavy, was plastered to her skin. Her shoulders were hunched, drawn in tight like a rabbit hiding from a hawk. What was left of her dress was in tatters, ripped clean down the middle, and Colt felt his throat go dry before he forced himself to look away, to give her some dignity. She must have heard him. She spun around, and her eyes, wide and black with terror, locked onto his. One arm flew across her chest to cover herself. The other pointed a trembling finger toward the riverbank. There, in the mud, were scraps of fabric, shreds of what used to be her life. Her feet were cut, bruised. Her arms were a road map of misery, marked with welts both old and new. "They stole my clothes, cowboy," she repeated, her voice raw. "Please, help me." Colt didn't move. He stood there, a man carved from desert dust and hard living, and he weighed the moment. He was 37 years old. He'd served as a scout for the army, seen things that would turn another man's soul to poison. He'd buried a wife 3 years back, taken by a fever that swept through in the spring. Since then, his world was this ranch, this silence. This woman was trouble. The kind of trouble that follows a man, that dogs his steps and doesn't let go. Bringing her into his home was like inviting a storm through the front door. But then he looked at her face, at the fear etched so deep it was practically carved into her bones. And every bit of caution, every warning his gut was screaming at him, just turned to dust. He slowly, deliberately, shrugged off his heavy canvas coat. He held it out, taking a careful step forward, showing her his empty hands. He didn't want to spook her. Her eyes darted from his face to the coat, searching for the trap, for the lie. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of cornered men and frightened animals. It was the look of someone who knew the world was filled with teeth. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, she lunged. She snatched the coat from his grasp, spun away, and curled into herself, clutching the fabric to her chest like a shield. "It's all right," Colt murmured, his voice low and steady. He waited. He gave her a moment to breathe. Then he moved forward again and gently took her by the elbow to help her from the river. Her skin was like ice, even in the fading heat of the day. She was trembling so hard he could feel it vibrate up his arm. As he helped her up the bank, he saw more scratches, more bruises. The torn neckline of her dress revealed the sharp, unforgiving ridges of her ribs. This woman hadn't eaten a square meal in a long, long time. He led her to Dusty, and when her legs buckled, he lifted her into the saddle without a word. She was light, frighteningly light. She clung to the saddle horn as he mounted up behind her. And then, without asking, her small, cold fingers wrapped themselves into the back of his shirt, holding on for dear life. The ride back to the cabin was long and silent. The only sound was the clip-clop of Dusty's hooves and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. Colt could feel her shivering against his back the entire way. He didn't push the horse. He let her set the pace. When they finally reached the small, rough-hewn cabin that he called home, he dismounted first. He reached up to help her down, and she nearly fell into his arms, her strength completely gone. Inside, he lit a single lantern. The flame cast a warm, yellow glow on the simple room. One table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot in the corner, and a wood stove. It hadn't changed a bit since his wife Martha had passed. He found it easier that way, less to think about, less to remember. "You can sit here," he said, placing a folded wool blanket on the floor near the stove. She sank down onto it, still wrapped in his coat, her eyes darting around the small space. She looked like she expected the walls to close in, or for a monster to burst through the door at any second. Colt didn't ask questions, not yet. Instead, he went about his chores. He stoked the fire in the stove until it crackled to life. He set a pot of water on to boil. Then he pulled out a small sewing kit from a wooden chest. The woman's dress was nearly torn in two, a sorry sight. He threaded a needle and began to stitch it back together. His fingers were clumsy, used to rope and leather, not delicate fabric, but his stitches were strong and firm. She watched him the entire time. Her dark, haunted eyes never left his hands. It was like she was trying to decide if those hands were capable of kindness or if it was all just a trick. By the time he finished, the cabin was warm. The trembling had mostly stopped, but the suspicion in her gaze remained, hard as flint. Colt sat back on his heels and looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He didn't know her name. He didn't know what kind of men had left her in that river. But he knew one thing. She was alive. And for tonight at least, she was safe. For a man like Colt, that was enough to start with. He set the mended dress aside and leaned back against the wall, letting the fire fill the silence. Tomorrow. Tomorrow he would ask his questions. Tonight, he would just keep watch. Colt didn't sleep a wink that night. He sat at the small table, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes fixed on the cabin door. Every rustle of leaves, every hoot of a distant owl had him tensing up. The fire burned down to glowing embers, casting long dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Behind him, by the stove, the young woman was a huddled shape under his coat and the blanket. She slept, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. She whimpered softly now and then, her breathing uneven, as if the ghosts that chased her in the daylight were still hunting her in her dreams. This wasn't new to him. He'd given shelter to wounded men before. Deserters, scouts, men on the run from something they couldn't name. But this was different. The silence from her was heavier than any story he'd ever been told. The danger she was in felt like a living thing, a predator lurking just outside the thin wooden walls of his cabin, and not knowing its name is what kept him awake. When the first hint of dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, Colt quietly got up and coaxed the fire back to life. The smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee slowly filled the small space. It was the coffee that woke her. She sat up, clutching the coat around her like armor. Her long, dark hair was a tangled curtain hiding her face. "There's a wash basin out on the porch," he said, his voice quiet so as not to startle her. "No one ever comes by this early." She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the door, then gave a small, jerky nod. As she stood up, the coat slipped from her shoulder for just a second. In the dim light, Colt saw it. Raw red marks, angry welts that looked like they'd been made by a rope. She covered herself quickly, but he'd already seen. He walked outside with her but kept his distance. He turned his back and started splitting firewood, the rhythmic thump of the axe a steady counterpoint to the splashing of water from the basin. He didn't want her to feel like he was watching her every move. When she came back inside, her face was clean and her hair was damp. But the fear was still there, clinging to her like a second skin. He poured 2 mugs of black coffee and held one out to her. She stared at the mug, then at him for a long, silent moment. Finally, her hand snaked out and took it. "You got a name?" he asked gently. She took a sip of the coffee, hiding behind the steam. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Isabella." He nodded. I'm Colt Remington. He let the silence sit for a moment before he pushed. You want to tell me what happened, Isabella? Her knuckles were white where she gripped the mug. She stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in her dark eyes. It was a long time before she spoke. 3 men, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was almost scarier than tears would have been. White men. I was passing near town. They saw me. They stopped me. Colt's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. They just took your clothes? He pressed, needing to know. She nodded. And the corn I was carrying, they threw it in the dirt. Laughed while they did it. The words were simple, but the shame rolling off her was a physical thing. He could almost feel it. He pictured the kind of men who hung around the saloon too long, their brains pickled with cheap whiskey, looking for someone weaker to prove they were strong. An Apache woman? Alone on the road? She would have been an easy target. You have family near here? He asked. Her head snapped up, a spark of something fierce in her eyes. No. I came north looking for work. There's nothing left in the south. That told him everything he needed to know. The army had swept through the south, leaving burned camps and scattered people in their wake. She was a survivor. She was lucky to be alive at all. He leaned back in his chair. The smart thing to do would be to take her to town. Leave her with the sheriff. But that would mean questions. Attention. And something told him attention was the last thing this woman needed. Leaving her to fend for herself out here wasn't an option. She wouldn't last 2 days. You can stay, he said, the words coming out before he could think them through. Stay a while, until you figure out where you're going. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Why? Because I've got the space, he said simply, and I don't let people starve on my doorstep. She didn't thank him. She just set her empty mug on the floor and pulled his coat, her shield, tighter around her shoulders. But Colt thought he saw something in her eyes change, a flicker of something that wasn't pure terror. But then, as she looked past him, toward the window, her whole body went rigid, her breath hitched. What is it? He asked, turning to follow her gaze. There was nothing there. Just the empty yard, the corral, the endless stretch of dusty land. She shook her head, but her eyes were still wide. I thought I saw one of them. The hat he wore. Colt stood up and went to the window, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Not a soul. It was probably just a trick of the light, her mind playing games on her after what she'd been through. You're safe here, he said, trying to reassure her. She looked at him, and her next words sent a chill down his spine. No one is safe, she whispered. They didn't just take my corn. They were looking for something. And just like that, the simple story of a cruel attack twisted into something darker, something much more dangerous. Looking for what? Colt asked, his voice low and urgent. Isabella, or Bella as he'd started to call her in his mind, just shook her head, her eyes glued to the empty landscape outside the window. She was staring at the horizon, like she expected an army to come riding over it. They kept asking me where it was, she finally whispered, her voice trembling. They searched everything, the sack of corn, my dress. That's why they tore it. A cold knot formed in Colt's stomach. This wasn't about some boys having a cruel bit of fun. This was a search, a hunt, and she was the prey. What was it, Bella? He pressed, keeping his voice calm, trying not to spook her further. What were they looking for? She finally turned from the window, her dark eyes locking with his. He could see the conflict in them, the fear of telling him, warring with the fear of keeping it to herself. A stone, she said, so quietly he had to lean in to hear. A small carved stone. It belonged to my grandfather. Colt frowned. A stone? Why would they want that? It's not just a stone, she said, a flicker of the fire he'd seen earlier returning to her eyes. It shows the way, to a place of water, a hidden spring deep in the mountains, a place our people can go where they won't be found. A map. They were after a map. In this dry, unforgiving land, water was more precious than gold. A hidden spring would be a treasure beyond measure, something men would kill for, and these men had already proven they were capable of anything. "Did they find it?" he asked. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "I had already hidden it, before I even saw them coming." So she still had it, which meant they would be back. They wouldn't give up on a prize like that. His simple act of kindness, of offering a woman shelter, had just put him square in the middle of a hunt. "You need to tell me who they were," he said, his voice firm now. "A name. Anything." She hesitated, chewing on her lower lip. "One of them. The others called him Wade." Wade! The name hit Colt like a punch to the gut. Wade Bonner, the son of a local ranch hand, a worthless troublemaker who spent more time in the saloon than he did working. Colt had seen him around, a young man with a mean streak and a cruel smirk. But he always had 2 or 3 others with him, like dogs following a bigger dog. "If they come here," Colt said, his hand instinctively going to the rifle leaning against the wall, "you stay inside. You don't make a sound." Her chin lifted. "And you? What will you do?" "I'll do what's necessary," he said, his voice as hard as iron. The unspoken threat hung in the air between them. They both knew this wasn't going to end with just a warning. Wade Bonner wasn't the type to be scared off easily. After a tense breakfast, Colt handed her the dress he had patched up. The seams were rough, but they would hold. He turned his back while she changed in the corner, staring out the window, his mind racing. He had to assume they were already looking for her. They would have tracked her to the river. They would be casting about, trying to pick up her trail. When she stepped out, she looked different. The mended dress gave her a sliver of her dignity back. But the fear was still there, a constant shadow in her eyes. "I've got work to do," he said, grabbing his hat. "You can stay here and rest." "No," she said, her voice stronger than he'd heard it yet. "I'll come with you. I don't want to be alone." He understood. Being alone in that cabin would feel like being in a trap, just waiting for the door to be kicked in. They walked the fence line together, the big man and the small, haunted woman. She stayed close, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. She moved with a limp from her cut feet, but she never complained. After a while, she started handing him tools before he even had to ask, anticipating his next move. By midday, the sun was a hammer overhead. Colt stopped at the creek to water Dusty. Bella knelt by the water's edge, washing the dust from her legs. She always kept her back to him, he noticed. It wasn't about being modest. It was about not leaving herself exposed, not having a blind spot. "You don't need to be looking over your shoulder out here," he said softly. "I always look over my shoulder," she replied without turning. "It's what has kept me alive." Her words were a stark reminder of the world she came from, a world so different from his quiet, lonely existence, a world where a moment of inattention could be your last. Back at the cabin, as dusk settled, a new tension filled the air. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Colt found himself watching the tree line, his hand never far from the pistol holstered at his hip. He didn't sleep on the porch that night. He brought his bedroll inside and laid it on the floor, between Bella's spot by the fire and the door. A silent promise, a human barrier. He lay awake for hours, listening to her restless breathing, the rifle by his side. He wasn't just offering her shelter anymore. He was standing guard. He had picked a side, and he had a sinking feeling that the war was coming to his front door, whether he wanted it to or not. Just before he finally drifted off, a thought struck him, cold and sharp. Wade Bonner was a bully and a thug, but he wasn't smart. He wasn't smart enough to know about a legend of a hidden spring. Someone else was pulling his strings, someone with more power and more to gain. This was bigger than 3 saloon rats, much bigger. The next 2 days were quiet, too quiet. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Colt and Bella fell into a rhythm. He would work the ranch, and she would help, her movements becoming more confident as her feet began to heal. She started tending to the small garden patch behind the cabin, her hands gentle as she coaxed life from the dry soil. But the peace was a thin veneer stretched over a pool of fear. They spoke little, but a silent understanding passed between them. Every time a horse nickered in the corral or the wind rattled the shutters, they would both freeze, their eyes meeting across the yard or the cabin, a shared question hanging in the air. Is it them? Colt found the stone by accident. He was moving a stack of firewood near the porch where Bella had been working. Tucked deep inside a hollowed-out log was a small leather pouch. He pulled it out. It was soft, worn with age. He opened the drawstring and tipped the contents into his calloused palm. It was a flat, smooth river stone, no bigger than his thumb. But carved into its surface was a delicate, intricate pattern, a series of lines and symbols that meant nothing to him, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was it. This was the map, the reason she was being hunted. Bella came out of the cabin and saw what he was holding. She froze, her face paling. "You found it?" she whispered. He closed his hand around the stone, its coolness a stark contrast to the heat of the day. "You shouldn't have kept it here," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "This is the first place they'd look." "It is all I have left of my grandfather," she said, her voice fierce. "It is the future of my people. I will not lose it." He could see the desperation in her eyes. This wasn't just about a spring. It was about survival, hope. "We need to get you away from here," he said, his mind racing. "I can take you north, to the next territory, get you on a stagecoach." "No," she said, stepping forward. "They will be watching the roads. They will be watching the towns. To run is to be caught." She was right. Whoever was behind Wade Bonner wouldn't be stupid. They would have every escape route covered. "Then what do we do?" he asked, feeling a rare flicker of helplessness. "We wait," she said, her gaze steady. "And we prepare. This is your land. You know it better than they do. We have the advantage here." He looked at her, truly looked at her. The terrified woman from the river was gone. In her place was a fighter. She wasn't just running from the storm. She was preparing to face it head on, and she was asking him to face it with her. That night, the quiet was broken. It started with a faint sound carried on the wind, the distant whinny of a horse that wasn't his. Colt was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. He blew out the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness, save for the faint glow of the dying fire. "Get down," he whispered to Bella. She was already on the floor, crouched behind the heavy wooden table, her breathing shallow but controlled. Colt crept to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. For a long time there was nothing, just the moonlit landscape, the familiar shapes of the corral and the shed. He was starting to think he'd imagined it. Then he saw them, 3 figures, moving low and fast, sticking to the shadows. They weren't coming for the cabin, not yet. They were heading for the corral, for his horses. A cold rage washed over him. They were trying to take away his means of escape, to trap them there. "They're after the horses," he murmured. "Stay here." He slipped out the back door, silent as a ghost. He circled around the cabin, using the woodpile and the shed for cover, the rifle held tight against his chest. The air was cold, and he could smell the dust kicked up by their boots. He got into position behind the water trough, the rough wood pressing against his back. He had a clear view of the corral gate. He could see Wade Bonner, his ugly smirk visible even in the moonlight, working on the latch. The other two were fanning out, keeping watch. Colt raised the rifle, the metal cool against his cheek. He lined up his shot, not at Wade, but at the wooden gatepost right next to his head. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot shattered the night. A splinter of wood exploded from the gatepost, inches from Wade's face. He yelped and threw himself backward into the dirt. "That's far enough, Bonner!" Colt's voice boomed through the darkness, hard as granite. "Next one won't miss." The other two men scrambled for cover. "Remington!" Wade snarled from the ground. "You're a dead man!" "Get off my land," Colt said, his voice dangerously calm. "Now!" There was a tense silence. Colt could hear them whispering frantically in the shadows. They hadn't expected a fight. They had expected a scared rancher and a terrified woman. Suddenly, a fourth figure emerged from the trees. This one was different, taller. He wore a long duster coat and a hat pulled down low, obscuring his face. He didn't seem panicked. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence that set every nerve in Colt's body on edge. The newcomer walked over to where Wade was still scrambling in the dirt and said something too low for Colt to hear. Wade got to his feet, dusting himself off, but he didn't look at Colt. He looked at the newcomer. He looked scared of him. This was the man pulling the strings. The man in the duster coat turned and looked directly toward the water trough, as if he knew exactly where Colt was hiding. He raised a hand, not in surrender, but in a gesture that looked almost like a salute. Then he turned and walked back into the darkness, Wade and his cronies scrambling after him. Colt stayed put, his rifle trained on the spot where they had disappeared, until the sound of their horses faded into the distance. He slowly rose to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He walked over to the corral. The gate was latched. His horses were safe. But he knew this was far from over. This was just the beginning. When he got back to the cabin, Bella was standing in the doorway, a heavy iron skillet clutched in her hands. She hadn't stayed behind the table. She had been ready to fight. "They're gone," he said, stepping inside. She set the skillet down, her hands trembling slightly. "Who was the fourth man?" "I don't know," Colt admitted, barring the door. "But he's the one we need to worry about." He walked over to the fireplace and picked up the hollow log where Bella had hidden the stone. He reached inside. It was empty. His blood ran cold. He turned the log over, shook it. Nothing. He looked at Bella. Her eyes were wide with a dawning horror. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice choked with disbelief. "But how?" Colt's mind reeled. They hadn't come inside. He had been watching the front. Unless... He strode to the back of the cabin, to the small window above the dry sink. The latch, which was always stiff, was now loose. A few fresh scratches marked the wood of the sill. Someone had been inside while they were all focused on the corral. The attack on the horses wasn't the main goal. It was a diversion, a brilliant, terrifyingly effective diversion. The man in the duster coat hadn't just shown up at the end. He had orchestrated the whole thing, and now he had what he came for. The loss of the stone hit Bella like a physical blow. She sank onto the floor by the cold hearth, her face a mask of despair. All that running, all that hiding, all for nothing. The hope for her people, the last link to her grandfather was gone, snatched from right under their noses. "He played us," Colt said, his voice a low growl of fury. He paced the small cabin, kicking himself for his mistake. He'd been so focused on the threat in front of him, the obvious danger of Wade Bonner, that he'd missed the real snake slithering in through the back. The attack on the horses. It was a show, to draw me out, to keep us both looking one way while someone else came in the other. "The man in the coat," Bella said, her voice hollow. "He has to be," Colt agreed. He was in charge. Wade was scared of him. A chilling thought occurred to him. How did they know where to look? How did they know about the loose log? Bella looked up, a new kind of fear in her eyes. No one knew. Only me. Think, Bella. Did anyone see you hide it? Back on the trail? She shook her head, her dark hair swinging. No, I was alone. I'm always careful. Then it hit Colt, a cold, dreadful certainty. They hadn't known where it was. They had searched the whole cabin, silently, expertly, while he and Bella were frozen, listening to the sounds outside. They must have been inside for minutes, a ghost in the shadows, moving through his home. The thought made his skin crawl. They'll be long gone by now, he said, the anger in his voice giving way to a grim resolve. Riding for the mountains. Then it's over, Bella whispered, defeat weighing down every word. We've lost. No, Colt said, stopping his pacing to stand over her. He knelt down, forcing her to look at him. It's not over. They have the map, but I have something they don't. She looked at him, confused. What? I know this land, he said, his eyes burning with an intensity she hadn't seen before. Every rock, every ravine, every dry wash. A stone map can show you the way, but it can't tell you about the shortcuts. It can't tell you where the rock slides are or which canyons flood when it rains. A tiny spark of hope flickered in Bella's eyes. And besides, Colt continued, a grim smile touching his lips, your grandfather was a clever man, wasn't he? Bella frowned. What do you mean? A map carved on a stone. It's simple. Too simple. What if it's not the whole story? What if the stone only makes sense if you know how to read it? Bella's breath caught in her throat. She thought back to her grandfather, a wise man full of stories and riddles. He never did anything the straightforward way. The song, she whispered, her eyes widening. He taught me a song when he gave me the stone. He said, the stone is the bone, but the song is the blood. One is useless without the other. What was the song? Colt asked, his heart starting to pound. It was about the stars, she said, her voice growing stronger with excitement. How the coyote follows the hunter in the sky, and how the hunter's belt points the way when the moon is sleeping. It was a code. The stone map was useless without the celestial navigation from the song. The man in the duster coat had the key, but he didn't have the instructions for the lock. They have the stone, Colt said, a plan beginning to form in his mind. But we have the song. They're going to the right place, but they're going to take the long way, the dangerous way. We can beat them there. He stood up and began to move with purpose. He grabbed a canvas sack and started filling it with supplies. Jerky, a canteen, a handful of bullets. Get your coat, he said to Bella. We ride at once. The despair was gone from her face, replaced by a fiery determination. She was on her feet in an instant, ready. They didn't take both horses. They needed to travel light and fast. Colt saddled Dusty, his best and most sure-footed mount. He swung himself up, then reached down and pulled Bella up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding on tight. They rode out of the yard, without a backward glance at the violated cabin. They were no longer the defenders. They were the hunters. They rode hard through the night, guided by the stars and Bella's whispered directions from the song. Colt pushed Dusty to the limit, navigating the treacherous terrain with an instinct born from years of living in the wild. He knew a path through the foothills, a dangerous, barely there trail that would cut 2 days off the journey to the mountains. It was a path the man in the duster coat would never find on his stone map. As the first rays of dawn touched the sky, they stopped to rest the horse in a hidden alcove of rocks. Colt looked back the way they had come. He'll know we're following him, Colt said. He's not stupid. He'll expect it. He will leave someone behind to watch his back trail, Bella agreed. It was a classic military tactic, one Colt had used himself countless times as a scout, leaving a sniper or a watcher behind to pick off any pursuers. We need to be smarter than him, Colt said. He looked around at the rocky landscape. An idea sparked in his mind. It was risky, incredibly risky, but it was the only way. He'll be expecting us to follow the most direct route, Colt mused, more to himself than to Bella. To come at him from behind. So we don't, Bella finished, understanding immediately. We go around. Exactly, Colt said. We're going to let his backwatch watch an empty trail. And we're going to come at him from the side, from where he least expects it. It meant adding half a day to their journey, a gamble that could cost them everything. But it was better than walking into an ambush. They set off again, this time turning west, into a series of jagged, wind-swept canyons known as the Devil's Teeth. It was a place most people avoided, a maze of rock and shadow. But Colt Remington was not most people. They found the trail of the other party by midday. 4 horses, just as he'd expected. They were moving at a steady pace, confident that no one was behind them. Colt dismounted, studying the tracks. "The man in the duster coat," he said, pointing to a set of prints. "His horse is carrying a heavy load, and it's a fine animal, shod with city shoes. This man isn't from around here." This piece of information was crucial. A city man wouldn't know the mountains. He was relying entirely on the stone. Suddenly, Bella grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in. "Listen," she hissed. Colt went still. At first, he heard nothing but the wind whistling through the rocks. Then he caught it, the faint sound of voices echoing from up ahead in the canyon. He and Bella crept forward, keeping low, until they could peer around a massive boulder. There, in a small clearing, were Wade Bonner and his 2 cronies. But the man in the duster coat was gone. They were sitting around a small, smokeless fire, arguing. "He said to wait here," one of them whined. "I don't like it. This place gives me the creeps." "Shut up," Wade snapped. "Thorne knows what he's doing. He's paying us good money to make sure that rancher doesn't follow him. We wait for him, we take care of him, and then we meet Thorne at the spring and we're rich." Thorne. The name dropped into the canyon like a stone. Elias Thorne, the powerful, ruthless land baron who had been buying up all the small ranches in the valley, using threats and intimidation to get what he wanted. A man who acted like he was above the law, because, for the most part, he was. He had the sheriff in his pocket and half the town on his payroll. And suddenly, it all made sense. This wasn't just about water, it was about land. Thorne wanted the entire valley, and a secret water source would make the land priceless. He would control everything. But for Colt, the name Thorne meant something else entirely. 3 years ago, his wife Martha hadn't died of a simple spring fever. She had gotten sick after their well had been mysteriously fouled. Colt had always suspected it was a tactic by Thorne to get him to sell his land, but he could never prove it. Now he knew. Thorne hadn't just tried to take his ranch, he had killed his wife. The fight for a stolen stone had just become a quest for revenge. A cold, calculating fury settled over Colt. He looked at the 3 men in the clearing. They were no longer just obstacles. They were the first step toward justice. He looked at Bella. Her face was grim. She had heard the name, too. She knew who Thorne was. She knew the stakes had just been raised to a terrifying new level. Colt put a finger to his lips, then pointed back the way they came. They retreated silently, their minds racing. "They're an ambush," Bella whispered when they were a safe distance away. "Left behind to kill you." "I know," Colt said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And Thorne is heading for the spring alone." "We can't fight 3 of them," she said, stating the obvious. "We don't have to fight them," Colt replied, a glint in his eye. "Not face to face." He led her and Dusty further into the labyrinth of the Devil's Teeth. He was moving with a new kind of purpose now. This was his territory. This was where his skills as a scout would come into play. He found what he was looking for an hour later, a narrow pass, barely wide enough for a single horse to get through. On one side, a sheer cliff face. On the other, a steep slope of loose rock and scree. It was a natural trap. "We wait here," he said. "They'll have to come this way to follow Thorn's trail." He explained the plan to Bella. It was simple, but it had to be executed perfectly. They didn't have to wait long. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, they heard the sound of horses approaching. Wade and his boys were riding single file, looking bored and arrogant. Colt and Bella were hidden in the rocks above the pass. As the last rider entered the narrowest point, Colt gave a sharp nod. Together they pushed a large, precariously balanced boulder at the top of the scree slope. It started a cascade. A river of rock and gravel poured down the slope, not with a loud crash, but with a terrifying, grinding roar. It didn't bury the men, but it completely blocked the path in front of them. Their horses panicked, rearing and screaming. At the same time, Colt fired his rifle into the cliff face behind them, sending shards of rock raining down, blocking their retreat. They were trapped, boxed in. Their horses were useless in the chaos of the shifting rock. "Remington!" Wade screamed, his voice filled with fury and a new note of panic. Colt didn't answer. He and Bella were already moving, slipping away through the rocks, leaving the three men to claw their way out of the trap on foot. It would take them hours. By the time they got out, Colt and Bella would be miles away. They had taken out the ambush without firing a single shot at a man. But as they rode away, the victory felt hollow. They had only delayed the inevitable. Thorn was still out there. He was ahead of them, getting closer to the spring with every passing minute. And he had no idea they were no longer behind him. They were in front. They had circled ahead and were now lying in wait. The hunt had changed. The prey was now setting the trap. Colking ahead of Thorn was a bigger gamble than Colt had realized. The terrain leading to the area of the spring was a treacherous maze of canyons and false summits. Without the stone map, Colt was relying on a combination of Bella's song, his own knowledge of the land, and pure gut instinct. They were racing against a man who had a direct path laid out for him. They pushed themselves and Dusty to the breaking point, moving through the twilight hours when the shadows were long and the landscape was deceptive. Bella's song about the stars was their only true guide. She would point to a specific notch in a distant ridge. "There," she'd whisper, "the hunter's shoulder. We go that way." It was during one of their brief stops to rest the horse that Bella revealed another piece of the puzzle. "Thorn didn't just want the water for the land," she said, her voice low. "My people. My grandfather told me stories. The spring isn't just water. The rocks around it are full of silver." Colt froze. Silver. It was always about money. Thorn didn't just want to control the valley's water. He wanted to build a mine. A mine would destroy the sacred spring, poison the land, and bring an army of men who would tear the mountains apart. This was a level of greed Colt could barely comprehend. The revelation gave their desperate race a new urgency. They weren't just trying to reclaim a piece of Bella's heritage. They were trying to save the mountain itself. They finally reached the place 2 days later. It wasn't what Colt expected. It was a small, hidden valley, a bowl of green tucked away amidst a fortress of red rock. At its center was a pool of water so clear it looked like liquid sky, surrounded by ferns and ancient, gnarled trees. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and pine. It was a place of profound peace. It felt wrong to bring violence here, but they had no choice. "He will come from that pass," Colt said, pointing to a narrow opening in the rocks to the south. "It's the only easy way in." They had a few hours at most before Thorn would arrive. They had to prepare. There was no good place to hide. The valley was too open. A direct confrontation was suicide. Thorn was a man who would be armed and ready. Colt was a scout, not a gunslinger. He preferred to outthink his enemy, not outdraw him. "The cave," Bella said suddenly, pointing to the rock face behind the pool. Colt hadn't even seen it. It was a dark slash in the rock, almost completely hidden by hanging moss and vines. Inside, it was larger than it looked. A single chamber, damp and cool. At the back, a trickle of water ran down the rock wall, feeding the pool outside. This was the source of the spring. "He'll check the cave," Colt said. "He'll want to see the source, see the silver." "I know," Bella said. A strange, determined look was on her face. "That is the trap." Her plan was audacious. They would wait inside the cave. When Thorn entered, he would be temporarily blinded, his eyes adjusting from the bright sun to the dim interior. In that moment of vulnerability, they would have the advantage. But there was a flaw. "It's one man against one man in a dark cave," Colt argued. "Too much can go wrong." "Not one man," Bella said, picking up a heavy fist-sized rock from the cave floor. "Two of us." Colt looked at her. The fear was gone. In its place was the cold, hard resolve of a warrior defending her home. He gave a single, sharp nod. They made their preparations. Colt found a narrow ledge high up on the cave wall, barely visible from the entrance. It was a tight squeeze, but he could lie flat on it, his rifle ready. Bella would hide in the deepest shadows near the back wall. Then they waited. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the slow drip, drip, drip of the water. Hours crawled by. Every nerve in Colt's body was stretched taut. Finally they heard it. The crunch of boots on gravel. Colt pressed himself flat against the ledge, his heart hammering against his ribs. He peered over the edge. Elias Thorne stepped into the entrance of the cave, a silhouette against the blinding light. He was a tall, imposing man in a fine duster coat, just as Colt remembered. He held a pistol in his hand, holding it ready. He wasn't taking any chances. Thorne paused, letting his eyes adjust. He took a slow step inside, then another, his gaze sweeping the chamber. He was cautious, methodical, a predator exploring a new den. He walked past Colt's hiding spot, his eyes fixed on the back of the cave, where the water trickled down the rocks. He was looking for the silver. Greed was pulling him forward. He took another step, and that's when Bella moved. She didn't scream or shout. She stepped out of the shadows, silent as a panther, and threw the rock with all her might. It wasn't aimed at his head. It was aimed at his gun hand. The rock struck Thorne's wrist with a sickening crunch. He cried out in pain, the pistol clattering to the cave floor. At the same instant, Colt dropped from the ledge, landing behind Thorne. He didn't give the bigger man a chance to recover. He slammed the butt of his rifle into Thorne's back, driving him to his knees. Thorne was a fighter. He roared with rage and tried to get up, swinging a fist blindly. But Colt was faster. He moved in, using the rifle as a lever, and pinned Thorne to the ground. It was over in seconds. Colt stood over the gasping, defeated man, the rifle pressed against his neck. Bella retrieved Thorne's pistol, her face grim and set. "It's over, Thorne," Colt said, his voice echoing in the cave. "You murdered my wife. You tried to steal this land. You're not walking away from this." Thorne laughed, a wheezing, painful sound. "You think you've won? You kill me, and the sheriff will hunt you down like a dog. My men are on their way. You have no proof of anything." "We don't need to kill you," Bella said, her voice ringing with cold authority. "And we have all the proof we need." She reached into Thorne's coat pocket and pulled out the smooth, carved river stone. Her stone. "This is all the proof the Apache nations will need," she said. "Proof that you tried to steal our sacred places. They will not forget this." Colt hauled Thorne to his feet. "You're not going to the sheriff," he said. "You're going somewhere much worse." They tied Thorne's hands with his own belt. They marched him out of the peaceful valley, back into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness. They didn't take him back toward town. They took him east, toward the lands where the Apache tribes had been relocated. "What are you doing?" Thorne demanded, panic finally seeping into his voice. "Giving you a trial," Colt said. "Not our kind." Hers. They left him bound and disarmed for Bella's people to find, along with the stone and the story of what he had done. They knew that justice here would be swifter and more absolute than any court in the territory could provide. Elias Thorne would answer for his crimes. As they rode away, leaving the land barren to his fate, a profound sense of peace settled over Colt. It wasn't the fiery satisfaction of revenge he had expected. It was quieter, deeper. It was the feeling of a circle finally being closed, of a great wrong being made right. The ride back to the ranch was different. The silence was no longer filled with tension and fear, but with a quiet companionship. They had faced the storm together and come out the other side. When they arrived, the cabin looked the same, but it felt different. It was no longer just a shelter, it was a home, a place they had fought for. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. The same stars that had guided them through the mountains. "What will you do now?" Colt asked softly. Bella looked at him, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time. "My people are safe. The spring is safe. My grandfather's memory is honored." She paused, her dark eyes searching his. I think I am tired of running." Colt reached out and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, a perfect fit. "You don't have to run anymore," he said. "You're home." The silence that followed was comfortable, easy. They had both lost so much, had their worlds torn apart by violence and greed. But here, in the quiet of the coming night, they had found something new, a beginning. Colt knew there would still be challenges. Wade Bonner and his crew were still out there somewhere. The town would be buzzing with the news of Thorne's disappearance. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next, because he wouldn't be facing it alone. They had faced down the devil himself and won. And in doing so, two lonely, broken people had found not just safety, but a home, right there in each other's company. The story of what happened to Elias Thorne became a whispered legend in the valley. Some said he simply vanished. Others claimed he was taken by spirits in the mountains. No one ever knew the truth except for the man and woman who had delivered him to a justice far older than the laws of the territory. Wade Bonner and his cronies, stranded and humiliated in the devil's teeth, eventually straggled back to town with a wild story about being attacked by Remington. But with Thorne gone, their money and their protection dried up. The sheriff, suddenly without his wealthy benefactor, had no interest in starting a war with a hardened ex-scout like Colt. Wade, stripped of his power, became just another saloon loudmouth, and eventually drifted away, a coward to the very end. Life at the ranch settled into a new kind of peace. It wasn't the empty silence of Colt's solitude, but a quiet, bustling peace filled with shared work and easy companionship. Bella's garden thrived under her patient hands. She brought a life to the small cabin that Colt had thought was lost forever with Martha. They never spoke of the chase, of the cave, or of Thorne. They didn't need to. It was a bond forged in fire, a shared history that was the bedrock of their new life. One evening, months later, they were sitting on the porch, as they often did, watching the sunset paint the sky. Bella was mending one of Colt's shirts, her stitches neat and even, a stark contrast to his own clumsy repairs on her dress that first night. "You never asked?" she said softly, not looking up from her work. "Asked what?" "Why I chose to stay." Colt was quiet for a moment, watching her. "I figured you had your reasons." She set the shirt aside and finally met his gaze. Her eyes were clear and bright, the old shadows of fear completely gone. "That first day, in the river, I was afraid of you," she admitted. "I thought you were just another man who would take what he wanted." "I remember," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But you didn't," she continued. "You gave me your coat. You mended my dress. You gave me your bed. You stood between me and them. You never asked for anything in return." She reached out and placed her hand on his rough, calloused one. "You showed me what a good man was, and I decided I wanted to build a life with one." Colt's throat felt tight. He couldn't find the words, so he just turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. The world was still a hard place. Danger still lurked in the shadows. But on that small patch of land, under the vast open sky, two survivors had built a fortress, not of wood and stone, but of trust, respect, and a quiet, unshakable love. They had found their own hidden spring, a source of strength and hope in a dry and thirsty world, and they knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that they would never be thirsty again. If you enjoyed this story of justice and survival in the Old West, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next tale. And let us know in the comments below, what do you think true justice really is? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching.